Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. Thanks to everybody on Zoom. My name is Dr. Laura Levitt-Huffman. I'm Senior Instructor of French here in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures. I'd like to welcome all our guests and participants to this Bellarmine Forum event, Critical Language Pedagogy, Learners as Agents of Social Change. And for those of you in the room, I invite you to help yourself to food and drink and get settled. And okay, there?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. As you're getting comfortable, it is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Jose Ignacio Badenes, who is joining us over Zoom. Professor Badenes wears many hats here at LMU. He's a member of the Jesuit community. He is Associate Provost for Undergraduate Education and Professor of Spanish here in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures since 1996. His research and scholarship have focused on 19th through 21st century peninsular Spanish literature, with particular interest in masculinity studies. And besides all of this, he is a warm and supportive colleague. Father Badenes, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Laura, for your warm introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. So as Laura just mentioned, my name is Jose Badenes, and I'm faculty, so professor of Spanish in my wonderful home, the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, but also associate professor for undergraduate education. This year, it is my pleasure to open today this event in the framework of the Bellarmine Forum 2023-2024. This year, the Bellarmine Forum's theme, Internationalization and the Liberal Arts, aligns with LMU and BCLA's strategic plans and reinforces the necessity for considering the liberal arts within an international context. I cannot think of a better site for this conversation to take place than my home department, the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures, since this department has a central position at LMU for international and multilingual learning. The event today, entitled Critical Language Pedagogy, Learners as Agents of Social Change, counts with the presence of Henry Giroux, our distinguished guest speaker. Professor Giroux is an internationally renowned writer and cultural critic, recognized as one of the top 50 educational thinkers in our times. The title of the talk today is Rethinking Education in a Time of Crises. I am sure that his talk will promote a stimulating conversation about education and social change in general, and the role of language study within internationalization in particular. In the second part, inspired by Professor Giroux's talk, the organizers would like to expand the conversation in a round table, discussing best practices in teaching language with a social justice emphasis through global and interdisciplinary lenses. I would like to thank in advance the organizers for putting together this event, my colleagues, Professors Alicia Partnoy, Yu Lee, Laura Huffman, and Rebecca Acevedo. I am grateful for the presence of all of you here today in the name of my colleagues, and I am confident that this event will promote a dynamic and stimulating conversation. Unfortunately, because of a previously scheduled event, I will need to leave immediately after these remarks, and I wish I could have stayed with all of you to listen to the talk and also engage in stimulating conversation. I will be with you in spirit, if not physically present. So, thank you very much.
Just to reintroduce, is it on? To reintroduce myself? At the button. Hello. To reintroduce myself, I am Laura Huffman. I teach French in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures.
Hi, how are you? Welcome, everybody. Rebecca Acevedo from Modern Languages and Literature Department, teaching Spanish.
Buenas tardes, Alicia Parnoy, profesora emérita, emeritus professor in the Department of Modern Languages.
Hello everyone, my name is Yuli. I coordinate the Chinese program here also in Modern Languages and Literatures. Welcome. Now, it is my great honor to give you a full introduction of our distinguished guest speaker. Professor Henry A. Giroux currently holds the chair for scholarship in the public interest in the English and Cultural Studies Department, McMaster University, where he is also the Paulo Freire Distinguished Scholar in Critical Pedagogy. In 2002, he was named as one of the top 50 educational thinkers of the modern period in 50 Modern Thinkers on Education, from Piaget to the present, as part of Routledge's Key Guides publication series. In 2007, he was named by the Toronto Star as one of the 12 Canadians changing the way we think. His most recent books include The Public in Peril, American Nightmare, Facing the Challenge of Fascism, The Terror of the Unforeseen, Neoliberalism's War on Higher Education, On Critical Pedagogy, Race, Politics, and Pandemic Pedagogy, Education in a Time of Crisis, Pedagogy of Resistance Against Manufactured Ignorance, Insurrections, Education in the Age of Counter-Revolutionary Politics. And most recently, Fascism on Trial, the Possibility of Democracy. Professor Giroux is also on the board of directors for Truth Out, a nonprofit news organization dedicated to providing independent reporting and commentary on a diverse range of social justice issues. His primary research areas are cultural studies, youth studies, critical pedagogy, popular culture, media studies, social theory, and the politics of higher and public education. He is particularly interested in what he calls the war on youth, the corporatization of higher education, the politics of neoliberalism, the assault on civic literacy, and the collapse of public memory, public pedagogy, the educative nature of politics, and the rise of various youth movements across the globe. Now, to keep this introduction brief, I'd like to direct your attention to his website for more information. So again, Professor Giroux's talk today is titled Rethinking Education in a Time of Crisis. Please reserve your questions until after his talk, when we'll be opening up for Q&A. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Henry Giroux.
First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me. I'm truly honored. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And thank you for introducing me to the various people associated with putting this on. Again, it's really, truly an honor. I'm delighted to be here because I think that it's an important time to talk about education and the urgency of the times and the threats that we face. I don't think that in the 60 years, 50 years that I've been in education, I've ever seen a time more perilous and more dangerous with respect to the relations, with respect to undermining the relationship between democracy and education, not only in the United States, but across the globe. And with that in mind, with that sense of urgency, in a sense motivating my talk, let me begin. In the age of emerging fascism, higher education is under siege. Its off-stated purpose to produce the civic foundations of the literacies necessary to support critical thinking, expand the radical imagination, and nurture individual and social agency has been attacked and is increasingly disparaged. This is evident as Trump, Florida Governor DeSantis, and other right-wing politicians in the United States, of course, view universities as objects of disdain, increasingly intent on turning them into spaces of white Christian nationalist indoctrination centers, and doing everything they can to undermine whatever civic possibilities they may have. The far right is doing everything it can to remove education from a language that highlights the role education might play, not only in a democracy, but also in an historical moment marked by a growing fascist politics across the globe. In a world shaped increasingly by an emerging authoritarianism, it's become more difficult to remember what a purposeful and substantive democracy looks like, or for that matter, what the idea of democracy might even suggest. Democracy as an ideal, a promise, and a working practice is under assault, just as a number of far-right educational, economic, military, and religious fundamentalisms are gaining ascendancy in American society and abroad. Increasingly, it becomes more challenging to inhabit those public spaces where politics thrives, where thinking, speaking, and acting subjects engage and critically address the major forces and problems bearing down on their lives. In this new moment in history, the question of how society should imagine itself or what its future might hold has become more demanding, if not more difficult. As a robust democratic public space of the social is lost to the imperatives of commerce and the forces of authoritarianism, the view of education as a democratic public sphere and critical pedagogy as a project of empowerment is both attacked and devalued. This is clear in the right-wing rhetoric of McCarthyism used daily by Republicans to describe American schools. For instance, Senator Marco Rubio of Florida has called schools a cesspool of Marxist indoctrination. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo claims that teachers' unions and the filth they're teaching our kids will take the republic down. Former President Trump has stated that pink-haired communists are teaching our kids and that Marxist maniacs and lunatics run higher education. We only wish. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis stated on Fox News that if he won the presidency, of course, before he dropped out, if he won the presidency in 2024, he will destroy leftism in this country and leave woke ideology in the dustbin of history. This is more than anti-democratic and authoritarian rhetoric. It also shapes poisonous policies in which education is transformed into an animating space of repression, violence, and weaponized as a tool of censorship, state indoctrination, and discrimination. Under the current emerging authoritarianism, the role of education in cultivating a critical citizenry capable of participating in and shaping a democratic society is being undermined, if not lost. Lost also is an educational vision that, it seems to me, takes people beyond the world of common sense, functions as a form of provocation, teaches them to be creative, exposes individuals to a variety of great traditions, embraces the arts, and creates the pedagogical conditions for individuals to expand what we might call a range of human possibilities. Under the influence of corporate power and growing authoritarianism in the United States, education in multiple informal and formal platforms operates increasingly in the service of lies, racism, unchecked market values, and a full-fledged assault on critical consciousness and public values. Under such circumstances, education becomes vocationalized. Democracy is cast as the enemy of freedom, and politics turns dark. The long shadow of domestic fascism, defined as a project of racial and cultural cleansing, is with us once again. both in North America and throughout the globe. Educators have seen the ghost of fascism before in acts of savage colonialism and dispossession, in an era of slavery marked by the brutality of whippings and neck irons, and in a Jim Crow age, most obviously in the spectacularized horror of murderous lynchings. In the 20th century, we reviewed fascist acts of terror in a politics of disappearance and genocidal erasures, under the dictatorships, of course, of Adolf Hitler, Augusto Pinochet in Chile, and others. In each case, history has given us a glimpse of what the end of humanity would look like. Yet, the lessons of history, with its language of ignorance, hate, machineries of torture, death camps, and murderous violence as a political tool, are too often ignored. A truthful reckoning of America's violent past is under siege. The history of America's slave labor camps and genocidal cleansing of Native Americans either disappear or are censored by Republican Party politicians. Such attacks on historical memory bring to mind the late philosopher Ernst Bloch's trenchant reflection, quote, "The most tragic form of loss isn't the loss of security. It's the loss of the capacity to imagine that things could be different." In the current era of what I call apartheid pedagogy, attempts are being made by the modern Republican extremist politicians to rewrite the narrative regarding who counts as an American. The whitening of collective identity is largely reproduced by reactionary attacks on diversity and race sensitivity training, critical race programs in government, undocumented immigrants, and issues dealing with racial inequality in the school curriculum. How else to explain that in Florida, teachers have been told to put a positive spin on slavery? How else to explain one Texas school district removing books from libraries in order to turn them into detention centers, which is nothing more than another example of the war on youth? How else to explain a Missouri bill that would charge teachers who use trans kids' pronouns with a felony no less, levy a $10,000 fine, threaten imprisonment, and place them on the state's sexual offender registry? Can you imagine? Putting them on that registry means they cannot get a job, they cannot live near a school, and more than likely will never teach in a school again. In Idaho, professors who teach, discuss, or write about abortion may now face up to 14 years of imprisonment. So coupled with these serious acts of repression and censorship is a mega party that is waging a war on anyone who does not conform to a white Christian nationalist notion of what it means to be a citizen. Warning signs of an horrendous time in history also reappear in the updated fascist rhetoric of Trump, who has various rallies, especially most recently, has stated that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country, a phrase that Hitler used in his manifesto Mein Kampf. This is the language of white supremacists and neo-fascists, and its ideology is driving the banning of books, largely about racism, trans people, and sexual orientation. This is the language of racial purity that gave birth to fascism and concentration camps. It's a language now espoused by Viktor Orban in Hungary, a favorite of Trump and the mega Republicans, who has publicly espoused, if you believe this, eliminating what he calls mixed races. The current attacks on critical race theory, if not critical thinking itself, are but one instance of the rise of authoritarian pedagogy. This is a pedagogy in which education is used in the service of dominant power in order to normalize racism, class inequities, and economic inequality, while safeguarding the interest of those who benefit from such inequities. In pursuit of such a project, far-right politicians impose a pedagogy of oppression, complacency, and mindless discipline. They ignore or downplay matters of injustice and the common good, and rarely embrace notions of community and social responsibility as part of a pedagogy that engages pressing social, economic, and problems, and of course, social justice. Instead of a civic education that enriches the public imagination, they endorse elements of indoctrination central to formalizing and updating a mode of authoritarian politics. Let's be reminded here that the goal here is to bring an end to public and higher education as democratic public spheres in order to destroy their critical function and willingness to engage students to become knowledgeable and critical active citizens. The threat of authoritarianism has become more dangerous than ever. This authoritarian project is evident particularly in the US, as a number of far right-wing governors have put into place a range of reactionary policies that of which the banning of books, of course, is the most obvious and in many ways the most dangerous. Books that speak to repressive moments of the past, systemic racism, and class images in art have been censored in states such as Texas, Utah, and Missouri, and of course South Carolina, and a number of other right-wing states as well. Not only are these attacks on certain books and ideas aimed at educators and minorities of class and color, this far right-wing attack on education is also part of a larger war on the very ability to think, to question, and to engage in politics from the vantage point of being critical, informed, and willing to engage, to say the very least, in a culture of questioning. Under the rule of this emerging authoritarianism, political extremists are attempting to turn education into a space for killing the imagination, a place where provocative ideas are banished and where faculty and students are punished through the threat of force or harsh disciplinary measures for speaking out, engaging in dissent, and holding power accountable. Now, this is really quite new in American history. During the McCarthy era, people were simply fired for affiliating with certain kinds of organizations. Now what we have is a far right that basically is doing everything it can to actually move into schools and to control every level of governance, every level of power, and every level of how knowledge is produced and how pedagogy is articulated. It's hard to imagine a more urgent moment for making education central to politics. And at stake here is a notion of education as a moral and political project rooted in the goal of individual empowerment and social emancipation. This is a view of education that is not a method, it's a project. It encourages human agency, one that is not content to enable people to be only critical thinkers, but also to be engaged individuals and social agents. Building on the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois, John Dewey, and Paulo Freire, this is a pedagogical progress that recognizes, and I think this is really crucial, there is no democracy without knowledgeable and informed citizens. This is a pedagogical practice that, as I said earlier, that calls students beyond themselves, affirms the ethical imperative to care for others, embraces historical memory, and works to dismantle structures of domination and enables students to become subjects rather than the objects of history, politics, and power. If educators are going to develop a politics capable of awakening students' critical, imaginative, and historical sensibilities, it's absolutely vital to engage education as a project of individual and collective empowerment, a project based on the search for truth, an enlarging of the civic imagination, and the practice of freedom. We live at a time when the unthinkable has become so normalized that everything that can be said and everything that matters is unsaid. Moreover, this degrading of truth and the emptying of language makes it all the more difficult to distinguish good from evil, justice from injustice. And under such circumstances, the American public is rapidly losing a language and an ethical grammar that challenges the political and racist machineries of cruelty, state violence, and targeted exclusions. Critical pedagogy in both its symbolic and institutional forms has a vital role to play in fighting the resurgence of false renderings of history, white supremacy, religious fundamentalism, and accelerating militarism and ultranationalism. Everything that we now associate with Trump and his idiotic politicians who follow him. As far-right movements disseminate toxic, racist, and ultranationalist images of the past, it's essential to reclaim critical pedagogy and language, critical language, as a project crucial to developing and affirming historical consciousness and moral witnessing as central elements of education. This is especially true at a time when historical and social amnesia have become a national pastime, further normalizing an authoritarian politics that thrives on ignorance, fear, the suppression of dissent, and hate. the merging of power, new digital technologies, and everyday life have not only altered time and space, they've expanded the reach of culture as an educational force. And I think this is really a crucial point. And my point is, education is not simply about schooling any longer. Education is also about those cultural apparatuses that now dominate the ecosphere, which are really educational apparatuses, and are just as crucial as schooling, to say the least, in shaping identities, and shaping values, and shaping social relationships, and developing what we might call an anti-public imagination. Any viable notion of critical pedagogy needs to create the educational visions and tools to produce a shift in consciousness. It must be capable of recognizing both the scorched earth policies of a market-based system, a system based on staggering inequalities, and the twisted anti-democratic ideologies that support it. This shift in consciousness cannot occur without pedagogical interventions that speak to people in ways in which they can recognize themselves, identify with the issues being addressed, and place the privatization of their troubles in a broader context. There can be no authentic politics without what I call, and without Stuart Hall has called, a pedagogy of identification. Lacking this understanding, pedagogy all too easily becomes either a form of symbolic violence or is reduced to a jargonistic form of rhetoric that assaults and shames in one instance and confuses on the other. What it does not do is educate a broader set of publics. At the same time, if academics are going to function as public intellectuals, they need to combine the mutually independent roles of critical educator and active citizens. And in doing so, they should not only address their work to a broader public and important social issues, they also need to develop a language that connects everyday troubles to wider structures and presses the claim for economic and social justice. Taking a term from the scholar Aurelia Azoulay, educators need to practice what might be called a form of pedagogical citizenship, with a focus on its ability, when practiced thoughtfully, to remind us of our mutual responsibilities. One of the challenges facing the current generation of educators, students, and others is the need to address the question of what education should accomplish in a society, or more pointedly, what is the role of education in a democracy? What is the role of education in a time of tyranny? What pedagogical, political, and ethical responsibilities should educators, musicians, artists, journalists, and other cultural workers take on at a time when there is an alarming rise of authoritarian regimes, both in not only in the United States, of course, in Canada and North America and Latin America, but also across the globe? How can educational and pedagogical practices be connected to the resurrection of historical memory, new modes of solidarity, a resurgence in the radical imagination, and broad-based struggles for an insurrectional democracy? How can education be enlisted to fight against what the cultural theorist Mark Fisher once called neoliberalism's most brutal weapon, the slow cancellation of the future? Such a vision suggests resurrecting a democratic project that provides the possibility and the basis for imagining a life beyond a social order that is immersed in social inequality, endless assaults on the environment, and elevates war and militarization to the highest and more sanctified nationalist ideal. Under such circumstances, education becomes more than an obsession with accountability schemes, testing, market values, and an unreflective immersion in the crude empiricism of a data-obsessed, market-driven society. You know, as somebody who grew up in the 60s, it seemed to me that education had a mission. It defined itself, and it was struggling to define itself as a democratic public sphere. University presidents were concerned with great ideas, not just fundraising. Now, we endlessly as faculty find ourselves not only as part of what we might call a casualization of the labor force, but the only information we now get from the university is how to work with Zoom. Everything has been instrumentalized. We're back to a moment where education has been devoid of a language that gives it a sense of social justice, that gives it a sense of the promise of the future. Education and pedagogy should provide the conditions for young people to think about keeping a democracy alive and vibrant, and not simply training young people to be workers. An education for empowerment that functions as the practice of freedom should provide a classroom environment that is intellectually rigorous and critical, while allowing students to give voice to their experiences, aspirations, and dreams. It should be protective. It should be a protective and a courageous space in which students should be able to speak, write, and act, if you may, from a position of agency and informed judgment. It should be a place where education does the bridging work of connecting schools to the wider society, connects the self to others, and addresses important social and political issues. It should also provide the conditions for students to learn how to align themselves with an increased sense of social responsibility, coupled with a passion for equality, justice, and freedom. Every day, we find ourselves living in a society in which the media somehow leads us to believe that we can connect economic activity, political activity, and social activity from any notion of social cost. This is about the death of justice. This is about the death of social responsibility. It's about the death of ethics. If the emerging and rebranded authoritarianism in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere can be defeated, there's a need to make critical education an organizing principle of politics, and this in part means this can be done with a language that exposes and unravels lies, systems of oppression, corrupt relations of power, while making clear that an alternative future is possible. The first mark of any emancipatory possibility is to make power visible, is to make the forces of domination visible. Because when they're visible, we can begin to understand them. When we can begin to understand them, we can begin to critique them. When we can begin to critique them, we can begin to fight them, individually and collectively. The language of critical pedagogy and literacy are powerful tools in the search for truth and the condemnation of untruths and injustices, and can be used to make clear that fascism does not reside only in the past, and that its traces are always dormant, even in the strongest democracies. At the same time, language, however critical, is not enough, and should further provide the basis for not only thinking critically, but also for intervening in the world. Ignorance now rules America. Not the simple, if innocent, ignorance that comes from the absence of knowledge, but a malicious manufactured ignorance forged in the arrogance of refusing to think hard and critically about an issue, and to engage language in the pursuit of justice. Under such circumstances, there is a full-fledged attack on thoughtful reasoning, empathy, collective resistance, and the compassionate imagination. Words such as love, trust, freedom, responsibility, and choice have been deformed by an authoritarian ideology and market fundamentalism that narrows their meaning to either a commodity, or a reductive notion of self-interest, or generates a language of bigotry and hatred. What does it mean when a former president of the United States speaks endlessly at rallies and calls immigrants vermin, makes the claim that they're animals, and then goes out of his way not to apologize for it? The reach and power of the educational force of the wider culture has emerged at a time in which there's an overabundance of information, coupled with the rise of new digital and visual media, where cognitive models reinforce the assumption that reality be echoed rather than interrogated and critically comprehended. Language increasingly collapses into mere utility, a lifeless metric, and a market-driven machinery of social death. Reality TV and celebrity culture are the new models of public pedagogy and mass communication, which, when coupled with a society addicted to speed, overstimulation, and unchecked self-interest, create a powerful mode of public pedagogy that blurs the line between reality and entertainment, fact and fiction, good and evil, pleasure and sadism. What does it mean when all of a sudden 75 to 80% of the Republican Party believe that the election in 2020 was stolen, when in fact, clearly it wasn't? I mean, what does it mean when the media can function in a way to endlessly normalize a candidate for the presidency who shouldn't be normalized as simply a candidate, who represents something far more than a political candidate. He represents a dire threat to democracy and made a sincere attempt to overthrow it with the January 6th insurrection. The power of language is now measured against its ability to move crowds, vanquish thought, fuel hatred, and flee into a twittering cacophony of one-liners and promotional announcements. This is a language of intolerance and walls, toxic impulses, and a vehicle for amplifying rather than solving social problems. We might say criminalizing rather than solving social problems. It's a language in which words cannot wait for thoughts. And as such, the crucial relationship between education and the formation of critical agents is undermined. The current crisis of politics, agency, history, and memory necessitates educators develop a new political and pedagogical language for addressing the changing context and issues facing the world in which anti-democratic forces draw upon an unprecedented convergence of resources, financial, cultural, political, economic, scientific, military, and technological, to exercise powerful and diverse forms of control. Educators need a new language that allows them to think of major social issues such as racism, of course, sexism, disability, and war, in what C. Wright Mills once called in big and broad strokes, rather than address social problems independently and in a fragmented and limited way. Problems such as job discrimination, book censorship, the war on youth of color, they need to be analyzed in historical, relational, and comprehensive terms. It calls for educators to become border crossers, capable of speaking to multiple audiences while linking their scholarship to multiple social issues. Such a task is at odds with the normalized discourse of what I call gated disciplines, gated communities, and gated intellectuals. Politics loses its emancipatory possibilities if it cannot present the educational conditions for enabling students and others to think against the grain and realize themselves as informed, critical, and engaged individuals. There is no emancipatory politics without a pedagogy capable of awakening consciousness, challenging common sense, and creating modes of analysis in which people discover a moment of recognition that enables them to rethink the conditions that shape their lives. As a political and moral practice, pedagogy combines a language of critique and a vision of possibility to fight to revive civic literacy, civic activism, and a notion of shared and engaged citizenship. It provides a language that offers what I call the space of translation and connects freedom with social responsibility. We live in an age of ugly freedoms. These are freedoms that absolutely are locked within a notion of self-interest. They're locked within a notion of only what freedom can do for us and not what it means to basically embrace it as part of the common good and a sense of shared responsibility. In saying that, what follows, I want to say a few words about educated hope. And in addressing this issue, I believe that educators should create the conditions that enable young people to view cynicism as unconvincing and hope as practical. Hope in this instance is educational, removed from the fantasy of an idealism that is unaware of the constraints facing the struggle for a strong democratic society. This is not a Disney version of hope. Educated hope is a call to overlook the onerous conditions that shape both schools and the larger social order. Nor is it a blueprint removed from specific contexts and struggles. If pedagogy is about anything, it's about the contextual. It's about trying to understand the conditions in which we work so we can both learn from those conditions and make them meaningful in order to make them critical, in order to make them transformative. Educated hope provides a basis for dignifying the labor of teachers. It offers up critical knowledge linked to democratic social change and affirms shared responsibilities and encourages students to recognize ambivalence and uncertainty as fundamental dimensions of learning. Without hope, even in the darkest of times, there is no possibility for resistance, dissent, and struggle. Without hope, there is no agency. And without agency, there is no hope. Hope expands the space of the possible. It becomes a way of recognizing and naming the incomplete nature of the present. Such hope offers the possibility of thinking beyond the given. As the great writer and novelist Eduardo Galeano once argued, we live at a time when hope is wounded, but it's not lost. As Martin Luther King, John Dewey, Paulo Freire, and Nelson Mandela have stated, there is no project of freedom and liberation without education, and that changing attitudes and institutions are interrelated. Critical ideas are meaningless without critical institutions. And central to this insight is the notion advanced by Pierre Bourdieu that the most important forms of domination are not only economic, but also intellectual and pedagogical, and lie on the side of belief and persuasion. This suggests that academics bear a certain responsibility in acknowledging that the current fight against emerging authoritarianism and white nationalism across the globe is not only a struggle over economic structures or the commanding heights of corporate power, it's also a struggle over visions, ideas, consciousness, and the power to shift the culture itself. Any struggle for the promise of a democratic order will not take place if lies cancel out reason. Ignorance dismantles informed judgments, and truth succumbs to demagogic appeals to unchecked power. As Francisco Goya warned, the sleep of reason produces monsters. I want to conclude by making some suggestions, however incomplete, regarding what we can do as educators to save public and higher education and connect them to the broader struggle for democracy itself. First, in the midst of the current assault on public and higher education, educators need a language of imagined futures. And such a language should be defined through its claims on democracy and a critical pedagogy that disturbs, inspires, and energizes students to think critically and act on the conditions of the wider society that bear down on and shape their lives. This is a language that challenges the neoliberal notion of education, which tells students to simply invest in themselves as human capital. Second, educators also need to acknowledge and make good on the notion that there is no democracy without informed and knowledgeable citizens, and in doing so, affirm education's critical function and the crucial role it plays in promoting civic consciousness, civic courage, and civic engagement. I mean, I think many of you know that the attack on public education today, it's not against something called woke. I don't know what that is, except to suggest that anything that's critical or addresses important social responsibilities or has an ethical dimension to it is somehow anathema. But I think what we do realize is that the attack that we're seeing is on any institution that has a critical function. That's about the death of democracy, and that's about the rise of fascism. Fascism begins with language, and its first language is to demonize, its second language is to exterminate its critics, and the third part of that project is the concentration camp. Third, in a world driven by data, metrics, and fragmented knowledge, educators need to teach students to be border crossers who can think comprehensively, comparatively, and historically. I cannot stress this enough. All too often, we think in terms of fragments in isolated ways. We eliminate the historical, we eliminate the relational, we eliminate the comprehensive. And in doing so, we have no understanding of the larger totality that often informs private issues. One of the great weapons of neoliberalism and one of the great weapons of the current authoritarianism is to lead people to believe that all problems are individual problems, so that they have to blame themselves for the ecological disaster. They have to blame themselves for their poverty. They have to blame themselves for any of the problems that they see around them. This is a form of massive depoliticization. And we need to address it pedagogically, we need to address it as educators, and we need to address it theoretically. Fourth, it seems to me that educators need to defend critical education as the search for truth, the practice of freedom, and pedagogy, and as a pedagogy that enables students to write and act from a position of agency and empowerment. Such a task suggests that critical pedagogy should shift not only the way that people think, but also encourage them to shape for the better the world in which they find themselves. As the practice of freedom, critical pedagogy arises from the conviction that educators and other cultural workers have a responsibility to unsettle power, trouble consensus, and challenge common sense. My friend Bell Hooks used to say, educators, in a way mimicking James Baldwin, educators need to learn to talk back. Students need to learn to talk back. Students need to learn to basically draw upon the resources they have to define themselves from a position of strength and affirmation, from a position of agency, but also from a position of accountability in which they can be interrogated, in which they can learn to understand what it means to be a public intellectual, to be able to defend their views in a way in which they're both comfortable with and engaging about. Students, if I can put it another way, they need to learn to think dangerously. 6, educators need to argue for a notion of education that is viewed as inherently political. This often scares people. I mean, the right wants to say that education is neutral, it's not political, and that what we really need is an objective form of education. This is really nonsense. Education is never political. It's always political, sorry. It's always a struggle in some way over the acquisition of agency. It's always a struggle over what kinds of knowledge count. It's always a struggle over, in some fundamental way, about how power relations are shaped in a classroom. But most importantly, it's always a struggle about the future and how we're going to define that future, how we're going to define civic life, how we're going to define the larger society. Schools are never removed from issues of power. And at their best, they should be places where students realize themselves as thoughtful, informed, and critical citizens. I think there's an interesting way, of suggesting this. Look, we need to make a difference between politicizing education and political education. Political education teaches students about what it means to understand the conditions in which power relations bear down on knowledge, on values, on the books we read, the visions we embrace, the agency we undertook. Politicizing education, on the other hand, is something very different. And it cuts across the ideological spectrum. That's a form of education that says there's one way, this is the right way, and there's no other way. There's no cultural questioning here. There's no interrogation. There is just the awful, pernicious discourse of certainty and absolutism. Finally, it seems to me that education should be free. And federal funds that guarantee should provide a guarantee for quality education for everyone. The larger issue here is that education cannot serve the public good in a society marked by staggering inequality. Rather than build bombs, rather than send pernicious weapons to Gaza to be bombed on people who are basically starving, I mean, maybe we should use that money for something else. Maybe that money should be used for the public good. Maybe that money should be used to create infrastructures. Maybe that money should be used to eliminate inequality. Maybe that money should be used for healthcare, where nobody has to worry about making a choice between eating and taking their medicine. That, to me, is central to any notion of democracy. Finally, I want to suggest that in a society in which democracy is under siege, it's crucial to remember that alternative futures are possible and that acting on those beliefs is a precondition for making social change possible. This political and pedagogical project demands both, again, a language of critique and a language of possibility. If critique serves to hold power accountable, educated hope allows us to think otherwise in order to act otherwise, and to think against the grain of received opinion while imagining a future that does not repeat the predatory forces of the present. Without hope, as I said, there is no agency. At stake here is the courage to take on the challenge of what kind of world we want, what kind of future we want to build for our children. The great philosopher Ernst Bloch insisted that hope taps into our deepest experiences, and that without reason and justice, without it, reason and justice cannot blossom. In The Fire Next Time, James Baldwin adds a call for compassion and social responsibility to this notion of hope, one that is indebted to those who follow us. He writes, "Generations do not cease to be born. We are responsible to them. The moment that we break faith with one another, the sea engulfs us and the lights go out. Now more than ever, education must live up to the challenge of keeping the fires of resistance burning with a feverish intensity. Only then will we be able to keep the lights on and the future open. In addition to that eloquent appeal, I would say that history is open and that it's time to think differently in order to act differently, especially if as educators we want to imagine and fight for alternative democratic futures and build new horizons of possibility. Thank you.
Professor Giroux, thanks a lot for all your inspiration, for your profound analysis of the current crisis, and for the tools to transform our world. As a former disappeared in political prisoner in Argentina for 3 years, my generation Bible was Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and also Galeano's Open Veins of Latin America, and some of my students, former students, are here and could testify to the impact of those, which I carried with me. I was inspired by your revisiting in your book, groundbreaking Pedagogy of Resistance, by your revisiting of Freire's Pedagogy of Hope. And my question here goes, Freire's works are pregnant with examples of practical, applications of his theories. And I, for the sake of hope and for the sake of that educated hope that you are illuminating us about, can you share some of those experiences of resistance in your campus, in other campuses? I mean, you have a wide view of what's going on in education and resistance in America, at least in the world, maybe too. Can you give us some examples that will keep our hope up?
I think there are a ton of examples. I mean, we can talk about examples in which teachers are endlessly, educators across the country, particularly in the United States, are now endlessly striking in some way to both raise their wages and to gain some control over the conditions of their labor. I think we see the automotive union in the United States, we see the rise of labor unions in some way fundamentally engaging in a politics and a pedagogy that's trying to make people aware in some fundamental way of the way in which capitalism has oppressed labor and many other public institutions in ways that unsettle and destroy what democracy is about. I think we see a number of youth movements in the United States that are engaging in multiple forms of pedagogy. The Black Lives Matter movement, for instance, it's not only engaged in essentially contesting police violence, it's now broadened its pedagogical horizons to take up a whole range of issues, from the criminalization of social problems to the attacks on public schools. We see young people who are fighting against gun violence in schools, walking out of schools and engaging in strikes. We see an environmental movement across the country in which young people are actively engaged and trying to, in some way, overcome those economic forces that are destroying the environment. We see a massive movement on the part of women's rights that are now engaging in an attempt to reclaim the reproductive rights that they deserve. But we see also something else. We see the rise of young people around questions of sexual orientation and exclusion, fighting back in ways we haven't seen before. The LGBTQ movement is an enormously powerful movement now in this country that's putting enormous pressure on schools. And I think that in the United States and in Europe and in other places, what we're seeing a link between politics and education in ways in which people are using alternative media and a whole range of cultural apparatuses to basically offer a different narrative about what justice might look like and to make oppression visible. So I think all of these movements, and in some way, are enormously inspiring and give us hope in terms of what might be done. Now, with respect particularly to higher education, I think that we need to recognize that while educators are now striking once again and regaining their momentum, somewhat similar to what happened in the 60s, that the educational ranks of educators has been decimated. That 70% of all faculty in the United States are basically part-time. We haven't mobilized enough in many ways to challenge that kind of assault. And I think that educators need to regroup and rethink what it means to work together collectively to take back higher education as a democratic public sphere. And I think they need to do that with young people. They need to do that by linking themselves to other social movements. And I think that they need to begin to write and read in a way that accentuates their role as public intellectuals.